Howdy, riders. Welcome back to a fantastic special episode of Ride Between the Wines. I had the very rare pleasure of speaking with Mark de Vere, master of wine, and maybe the first master of wine I've got to speak with, definitely the first one on my show. Very cool. So not only are we going to talk a little bit about that, but we're also going to talk about Robert Mondavi, a huge icon of Napa Valley and probably part of the reason that most Americans drink wine now. So very, very exciting episode. And towards the end of the episode, I'm going to speak with Jonathan Lopez, advanced sommelier, while we're talking about all of that, who has recently reopened Hampton Street Vineyard, which is a longtime staple of the Columbia, South Carolina restaurant scene. So great episode. Buckle up. Let's ride.
The world we live in is an amazing one, full of passion, wonderment, and of course, fine wine. This is the story of one man's journey to fully understand and appreciate that world. So kick the tires and light the fires. It's time to ride between the wines.
It's Burgundian in style. Just a whisper of cherry.
Very nice legs.
This is so perfectly balanced.
Such an old world style.
Is this laced with tobacco? A total fruit bomb.
I say, so fancy!
Welcome back to Ride Between the Wines. A very special episode today. So we have Mark de Vere, who is, we're going to talk a lot about Robert Mondavi Winery, but also a master of wine, which is definitely the first master of wine I've had on here, and maybe the first one I've met. There's not a whole lot of y'all floating around there. So very excited for both of those, but welcome. Thank you.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I want to start off by mentioning the tie to actually get you on the computer with me today, which is fantastic, was Kim Martz. And I'm going to tag up here somewhere, but Kim was actually in the car with me before, since podcast was originally in cars before COVID. And so she was actually in the car with me, and we were discussing all the women who have contributed so much for Constellation, because Constellation has obviously a huge number of women winemakers and within the history and current. So check that episode out. I'll tag it up here. But other than that, let's, if you don't mind, let's get started talking about you, where your background is. I'm quite interested.
Well, I'm talking to you now from Napa, California. I'm at home in the city of Napa, as you know, the south end of the beautiful Napa Valley. But you might by now have worked out I'm not from Napa originally. I grew up in England. I started in the wine trade in retail and wholesale in the UK. Okay. I worked in Australia for a while in production in vineyards and wineries, and then April 1997, I started a 6-month summer job at Robert Mondavi Winery, and I'm pleased to say, over 23 years later,
that's fantastic.
Continuing happily.
So what was your wine when you walked into Robert Mondavi? What was your role there?
Initially, I was what in those days my first business card said public relations, which these days I think is now called a wine educator, which to some people would be a tour guide.
So let's kind of jump ahead and talk a little bit about the Masters of Wine journey, because I didn't realize, I guess now that I've talked to you, that you're from England. But so the Masters of Wine program, in addition to the Quartermaster Sommeliers, those are both British originally programs. Is that accurate?
Certainly the Master of Wine started in London in the UK wine trade, and I believe the first Master Sommeliers were in the UK also, yes. Yeah.
Were you raised drinking wine? Was that a big part of the...
Well, not as if it wasn't like a French family, or the caricature of the French family with wine on the table, or Italian family with wine on the table. But my parents would have wine for Sunday lunch or for dinner parties, so it was around, but it wasn't like I grew up in a vineyard sort of thing.
Right.
But they had wine, and of course in the United Kingdom, it's legal to have a sip of wine a little earlier in age, and you can legally purchase, you can go into a wine shop and buy wine when you're 18 in the UK. So a little earlier start than in the US.
To
do it
nice.
Legally anyway.
I wish we would get there.
Being able to do it legally meant it was easier to do it in a learningful way, if that's a word.
No. It makes perfect sense. I'm a little jealous of that. So Master of Wine, because I think in my head I have a good idea what the difference is, but I like to go over it. But I think in my head, because of the Somm movie and the Somm TV show, like that, sommeliers is a term that at this point is thrown around a lot. But I don't think master of wine is quite, at least in the States or in my circles, where people think of it. What is the big difference between the two?
Well, obviously they're both very challenging,
amazing, right?
things to set about achieving. But I've never worked as a sommelier. I've never worked on premise really in the sommelier role. So I'm not that expert on the master sommelier program. But to call out some of the big differences, I think that fundamentally, originally, the master sommelier program, and still a large amount today, I think, sort of grew out of the sommelier on-premise restaurant side of the business, whereas the master of wine grew out of the wine trade, and which is slightly different. So it was originally for people trading in wine in whatever area of it, and so it covers. In some ways, that the expectation that, as I say it from the master of wine side, there's no service element to the master of wine side. There's no immediate live oral examination, as it were. It's all a written exam. And the challenge is it's very much about understanding the totality of the issues underlying the wine trade. And so it covers everything from, as you know, everything from understanding the underlying issues of planting a vineyard, managing a vineyard, growing grapes, harvesting, wine making, all the options for wine production and packaging and quality assurance and the commercialization and marketing and brand building, all the way through to social issues, historical issues, legal issues. So it really covers an understanding of the underlying issues, as it were, that brings the world of wine together, everything from before the vineyard's planted to after the glass is on the consumer's table. And so that's 5 written exams that cover those stages. And then there are, of course, 3 blind tasting exams. And I understand in the Master Sommelier program, that's a live, in-the-moment examination, which has its own, obviously, sure challenges. The Master of Wine, that's obviously a lot of pressure, slightly different format. It's 12 wines in 2.25 hours, and there are 3 of those exams. So typically the first exam is 12 white wines, and typically the second exam might be 12 red wines, and then the third exam might be the same again. Often things that don't fit into white or red, sparkling, fortified, but rosés sort of thing might appear in the third exam. But you have just over 2 hours to write out your understanding of the wine. So a different approach. And then there's a little, I shouldn't demean it, but there's, once you pass that exam, I shouldn't belittle it, there's then a research paper that you write after that. So quite an engaged.
There's a lot involved, yeah. When you get to the tasting portion, is it, are you tasting more for conclusions, or are you tasting more for the entire structure, everything? Like, is the right answer the important thing, or is it why you got to the right answer?
So I can't speak exactly for whatever examiner is looking for it. It'll be different for different wines, is another thing I would say. But they'll ask questions that are relevant to particular wines. And so it's not always about identifying exactly what the wine is. More it's about, the way I sort of sum it up, it's a test of, it's the Master of Wine exam. So are you a master of wine, meaning do you understand the wine? So they're looking to see, can you taste accurately, and can you then interpret those sensory impressions in a meaningful way and relate those to an understanding of the global wine business. So they'll ask different questions about different wines. Often it'll be winemaking questions. Often it'll be quality issues, which is a relevant thing to be able to understand. And it'll depend on the wine. And a large number of the points will, as it were, if you think of it in points, the large number of the points will be for your analysis. Did you taste it accurately? Did you draw out the relevant elements of the taste of wine and come to a logical conclusion that is, as it were, correct in terms of relating it to the world of wine?
Right.
Having said that, some wines there'll be more leeway to make an error, as it were, and that sometimes the examiners do give feedback, and they'll say, really, the classics you should be getting wrong. I'm sorry, the classics you should not be getting wrong, and it's going to look less good if you totally mistake a really classic class growth Bordeaux. But if it's a varietal wine in a, I don't want to say generic style, but in a modern international sort of style, and you say it's from Chile when it's from Australia, or say it's from the Paydock when it's from California, that's not going to lose you too many of the points, as it were. And often there have been wines in the exam, for example, a few years ago, they put an orange wine in, a skin fermented white wine, and they didn't ask. They didn't ask you to identify the grape variety or the origin. All the questions were about quality and winemaking and commercial application, because I think they recognize that when you've got a skin fermented orange wine, nailing down the exact variety and origin is not that fair in some ways. So it depends on the wine.
Well, that's very cool. Congratulations. I'm sure you've had it for a while. That's an awesome achievement. Very cool to hear. So at this point, your role with the winery is still, you're an educator? Is that? Yes,
it's, I'm, over the years, my role has evolved. I'm in different positions. Technically, I'm in our marketing department, and I work with some of the other fine wine portfolio. As you know, Mondavi Winery is now owned by Constellation Brands, and we have other beautiful wines in our luxury wine portfolio. However, my office is still at Mondavi Winery, and that's where a lot of my attention is spent. And it's a very wonderfully multifaceted role. In the normal course of events in a normal world, I spend a lot of time traveling, whether it's ambassador, you call it, or training or education. I also work a lot internally, as sort of internally consulting. I work with the winemakers a lot and taste and discuss. I work with our marketing people a lot and chat and discuss. And then whenever I can, get out and spread the word and spread my enthusiasm for the wines.
Enthusiasm seems like a word that goes with you very easily. Well, with that segue, let's jump into Robert Mondavi, which pioneer, awesome history, huge America success story. Give me the cliff notes of it. Tell me who this guy was.
And I expect many people on the call are familiar with Robert Mondavi and know the story. So yes, the cliff note version of it. However, it's worth telling again, and who knows who'll be tuning into this. I'm amazed that sometimes I come across even people in the trade. I was doing a tasting a couple of years ago, and literally one of our colleagues who was in the room to learn about Mondavi Winery, because his job was to sell Mondavi Winery wines, came up to me at the end and said, "I didn't know Robert Mondavi was a real person." And we live in a world of made-up wine.
Yeah, it's true.
We have to keep telling people the story so that it filters down to the new generations and everyone remembers. But yes, as your introduction said, one of the pioneers of New World wine, pioneers of certainly California and Napa. Many people would say Napa is what it is today, in large part to the energy and the spark that Mr. Mondavi brought, not just the spark, but the passion and the sort of follow through that he brought to it. And many people would say that the shift he made in Napa spread not only through California, but through the New World. And many people would say it had significant influences in the Old World as well. And there are many Italian and French winemakers who were inspired by Miss Mondavi, encouraged by Miss Mondavi, and talked with Miss Mondavi and other parts of the New World. I think it's a really fun story, a really inspiring story. I think, you know, Mike, the Mondavi Winery was founded in 1966, but Miss Mondavi he grew up in a wine family, and he grew up in an Italian family. And so to go back a bit in the story, Bob's parents, Cesare and Rosa, were immigrants from the Marche region of Italy, came over in the early 1900s, actually settled up in Minnesota, not wine country, but Italian settlers there would, one of the parts of their culture they brought with them was a glass of wine with dinner.
Mhm.
So it was actually Prohibition that brought the Mondavi family to California, because they couldn't pick up a jug of wine in the grocery store anymore. But Cesare, being having some experience in the grocery area, recognized an opportunity, came to California, started buying grapes and shipping them back east to Italian settlers. Of course, totally legal to be in the grape shipping
Great business, right?
But I think the intention was that people could make homemade wine from
Right.
those, that when they purchased those grapes. So, and there was a sort of semi loophole, as you know, in the Volstead Act, that it wasn't technically legal, but typically homemade wine sort of slipped through the homemade wine for mealtime
Homemade consumption,
sort of
right,
slipped
yeah.
through. Then after Prohibition, the family moved to. They settled originally in Lodi, then they moved to Napa after Prohibition, started making wine. But even in Napa, most of the production of wine was what we'd call, you know what I mean if I call it jug wine. It was
Yeah.
either bulk wine shipped out for other people to blend, or if it was packaged, it would have been bottled in a jug or a large form. So it wasn't very aspirational or quality focused. And Mr. Mondavi recognized that in Napa in particular, but coastal California, we have not only great soils for growing vines in, but this amazing climate, the warmth and the sunshine that brings out the opulence and easy to enjoy pleasure in the wines, but also the cold nights, the cool mornings that slows down the ripening, gives us the intensity in the flavors, and keeps the brightness and the freshness in the wine. So a notorious difference of opinion, I think, with the rest of the family, who had a very successful business in the low cost, high volume side of the wine world. So 1966, Bob started his own winery, Robert Mondavi Winery, and it was certainly a turning point moment, I think, for Napa. At the time, there were about 20 wineries in Napa, and as I say, most of the production was, I'm told, was shipped out in bulk or was going into jug wine. And this was the first major construction since 1934, since the year Prohibition ended, and the first major construction to have the intention of focusing on high quality wines, and with the vision of making wines in the company of the great wines of the world.
Right.
Of course, a different era back then. One of the things that's amusing to think about, that a couple of the quality statements that Mr. Mondavi sort of made in that day was, I'm only going to put wine in 750s or Magnum. In other words, I'm not doing jug. And that was a quality statement back in the day. That's what fine wines did. They were in 750 or Magnum. And he also, in a sort of swing against the sort of generics that were, Burgundy, Chablis type things, he said, I'm only going to make varietal wines. And so for many years, we only made varietally labeled wines, because he saw that as the future of quality in Napa. But an amazing story. And of course, that not only the vision he brought to it, but the energy and the enthusiasm, and he would inspire other people to join his mission, as it were. And so the Napa Valley landscape now, or winescape now, as you know, is totally different from what it was 55 years ago.
So wait, with the varietal labeling of the bottles, was that basically just him doing that? Was his neighbors doing anything?
Other people were doing it, but it was sort of a statement that I'm only going to be in the quality wine business. So I'm only going to make varietally labeled wines, and I'm only going to make put it in 750 or Magnum.
Or
I'm
Magnum,
not going to have any nothing
wine.
Involved in the jug wine, bulk wine generics, as it were. So that was a quality statement going forward. This is the bottom line quality entry point. We're going to be varietal, not generic. We're going to be in 750s, not jugs, and forward and upwards from there.
Oh, that's fantastic. And is the winery that was built in '66, was that where the winery is now, Oakville? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mr. Mondavi, of course, had lived in Napa. The family moved, so they moved to Lodi in 1920, and then they moved to Napa in 1937. So Bob had been in the valley for 30 years, so he knew where the good spots were. And of course, that location on the west side of Highway 29 in Oakville, right in the center of the valley, had a reputation from 100 years ago as being one of the great sites to grow great wine. So in 1966, he initially was able to purchase 12 acres of land. It's part of the inspiring story of Mr. Mondavi, I think, is we're sitting here talking about, you know who I mean, and we know who we mean, and he changed the world of wine. But he started what we know him for today when he was 53 years old. And at 53, he was basically, in some ways, sort of thrown out from the family winery. So as he pointed out, he couldn't get a bank loan. He had no collateral, but of course he had his passion and his inspiring energy. So he was able to persuade two friends to invest, and another friend underwrote the bank loan and for another loan, and $200,000 of borrowed money. He bought 12 acres of land and started to build a winery. And it all grew from there. So that's a long way to answer your question. Yes, it's still the original site. And as we often talk about our beautiful vineyard that we call our Tocolon Vineyard, right behind the winery. As I point out, we're not just talking about that as being a great vineyard because that's the vineyard we've got, but we're there deliberately. Bob knew that was where he wanted the winery to be and the vineyard to be to achieve his goal of making Napa Valley wines in the company of the great wines of the world.
He's just a guy with vision. He just knew it. That's great. Well, so on the same line as the enthusiasm and the excitement, and let's be honest, like the marketing genius that he had going on there, let's drink our first wine if we can. I think that's probably something that is a good segue there. So,
and I think you have the same as I have.
The Fume, I'm a 18 Fume is what I'm drinking here.
Yes, 18 Fume Blanc, the Mondavi Winery, Napa Valley Fume Blanc. And I'm glad you were excited to taste this with me because it's one of the two. So we'll taste this, and I think we're also going to, should we give a spoiler? We'll also taste the Reserve Cabernet at the end. And it's, if I had to encapsulate, as it were, the Mondavi Winery story and Mr. Mondavi's story, I think the Napa Valley Fume Blanc and the Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, it's the least expensive wine in the portfolio and the most expensive wine in the portfolio, but they're so good for telling the story of Mr. Mondavi's vision. And as I mentioned, we have to keep reminding people that even though Robert Mondavi was a real person in this world we live in of made-up names and made-up brands, and so reminding people that Robert Mondavi was a real person is part of it. But and I imagine many people on the call know, that Fume Blanc was a name that was invented by Robert Mondavi, but we have to keep reminding people of that if we want people to know, because not everybody knows that.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And so, as you know, Fume Blanc, alternative name for Sauvignon Blanc. But again, this goes back to the energy that Mr. Mondavi brought to wine in 1966. Because in the 60s, although there was Sauvignon Blanc grown in California and in Napa, it was almost always made into a sweet wine. And it was typically considered a low quality variety. And so consumer expectations, if you saw Sauvignon Blanc on the label, were that's going to be sweet and not very good. Cheap, sweet, not very prestigious. Mm-hmm. Bob, of course, knew that Sauvignon Blanc can make high quality dry wine. So in 1966, he made a high quality dry Sauvignon Blanc wine, and basically had to find a way to market it so that people knew it wasn't cheap sweet. So, and he was only making varietally labeled wines. So the easier thing to do in some ways would have been to trademark or copyright his fanciful name. But because he always wanted everybody to be able to share in his vision of elevating the quality in Napa and in California wines, he did something that's actually a lot harder to do, which is persuade what we'd now call them the TTB, in those days, of course, it was the ATF, to register Fume Blanc as a legal synonym, a legal permitted alternative name for the Sauvignon Blanc grape. So it's just on the TTB register as a legal alternative name for Sauvignon Blanc. And for many years, the label said Fume Blanc, and then in small letters underneath, it said dry Sauvignon Blanc. And it was really just a way that, for at least 30 years, it said, Fume Blanc and then dry Sauvignon Blanc underneath it. And so it was just a way to bring to market a style of high quality dry wine in an era where expectations for Sauvignon Blanc were something different. So I know that was a long time ago, but to me, it still tells of the entrepreneurial spirit and passion that Bob brought to the Napa Valley wine business.
Well, and it's not gone either. I mean, there's still, I mean, other people still call it, like Ferrari Carano jumps to mind. There's other Fumé Blancs out there.
Absolutely.
So
and anybody could, if it's legally, 75% is the varietal labeling law. So if it's 75% or more made of Sauvignon Blanc grapes, you could legally label it Fumé Blanc. There was initially, my feeling is it was initially a way of making a dry, high quality style. And that's, it's our story. So that's how I tell the story. Oh. In the early days, of course, another thing that Bob did in Napa as part of his vision for raising the quality, he was the first Napa Valley winery to have a significant dedication to French oak barrels, because he knew the great wines of France were made in, I'm going to say that, made in French oak. And so he bought French oak barrels, the first Napa winery to have a commitment to French oak barrels like that. I think in the early days, he was still learning how to use those French oak barrels correctly. And in the very early days, the first vintages of Fumé Blanc would have been stainless steel tank fermented, because another cool little side story, Mondavi Winery was the first Napa winery to have 100% stainless steel fermenting tanks for the production of the wine. So the wine would have been stainless steel fermented and then put into a new French oak barrel for aging. And I think when you do that, as you know, you get a much more obvious oaky character to the wine. And I think in the early days, people got the idea that Fumé Blanc meant it was going to be an oaky style of Sauvignon Blanc. Mm-hmm. Which it doesn't. It was really a way to, yes, he was using oak, but really he was trying to make wines in the company of the great wines of the world. He wanted to make high quality, dry, serious, as it were, when I say serious, it's still playful and fun, but serious quality wine from Sauvignon Blanc, and that's the name. And the reason I bring that up is because some people I think still do think Fumé Blanc means oaky, and you won't get any probably won't get any new oak aromas on this wine. It is still barrel fermented, or every year it's mostly, I think in this year it might have been 100% barrel fermented, but old oak. Mm-hmm. So the old oak gives a roundness, it gives a textural character. And these days, of course, for many, many years now, of course, we've fermented in barrel. And so rather than in the very early vintages, it was tank fermented and aged in barrel. Now we ferment in barrel, which even for the wines like our Chardonnay Reserve, where we do
use newer oak,
we want that to be integrated still. So this is fermented in barrel, which gives a textural character, and of course then that also intensifies the lees contact. So we want the barrel fermentation, but we don't want any new oak flavor. So I don't know how your nose is on this, but there might be 2% new oak in the mix or something. But basically, we're not looking for new oak character in this wine. And so that's why I try to remind people that Fumé Blanc is an alternative name for Sauvignon Blanc. It's Mr. Mondavi's energy and passion that he brought to raising the quality of Sauvignon Blanc. And it doesn't mean it's going to be oaky, because I think the idea that it means it's going to be oaky puts some people off from buying it. And if anybody did buy it because they particularly wanted an oaky wine,
they'd be disappointed, right?
It's a fun wine, though. So
it's delicious. Did he? So I don't know if did he pull the name from Puy Fumé, or is that?
So the inspiration and of course the justification, he had to have to say this. You can't just go along and say, I think this grape variety should be called this. He was able to say that traditionally in the Loire Valley, the variety has been known as Blanc Fumé or Fumé Blanc. He turned that around, got that turned around. And so it was because there had been a tradition in parts of the Loire Valley of calling the grape Blanc Fumé or Fumé Blanc. That's how he was able to get it as a synonym, saying this was historically an alternative name for the variety in France.
Guy really is a genius.
Yeah. And then as the other reason, so I think that's a cool story to tell, and it reminds us of the energy and the spirit he brought and the sharing spirit that he brought to wanting other people to join in the mission.
Yeah, I love that.
But I also love to start with this wine because it encapsulates the Robert Mondavi winery style to me. And sometimes people say, when I tell my story of how I started for a 6-month summer job and I'm still there 23 years later, sometimes people say, well, why did you stay? And I said, well, have you seen Napa Valley for a start? but more important than that, of course, I got to work with Bob. As you know, Mr. Mondavi passed away in 2008, so I overlapped with him for many years and got to work with him. I traveled with him, and I don't want to say fell under the spell, but the passion and the enthusiasm that had spread throughout everyone at the winery and so much around Napa, and I got that firsthand as well, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, no.
But even more important than that, I think, is that I fell in love with the wines, and I love the style of these wines, and I love not just the quality, but it's a style that to me is really satisfying and engaging, and I think the Napa Fumé Blanc is a great way to introduce that style. And if I were to sort of sum it up, I know you've had a sip, but I'll ask for your comments on it in a moment. But if I were to sum up the Robert Mondavi winery style, it's about having presence in the palate without being a big fruit bomb. It's about having concentration and intensity, and yet still being light and fresh and delicate. And when I taste this Fumé Blanc, it grabs my palate. It's intense, it's concentrated, but it's bright and vibrant and has such purity and freshness. And the vineyard characters come through. This is a blend of 2 of our vineyards. We have a vineyard in the Stag's Leap district, and when the Sauvignon Blanc grows in our Wappo Hill vineyard, as we call it, in Stag's Leap district, AVA, the Sauvignon Blanc there tends to get more sort of, I think of as citrus, lemon, lime, grapefruit characters, and that really shines through in here. And then the balance of the wine comes from the vineyard in Oakville, West Oakville, right behind the winery, the Tocolon vineyard, and that tends to give more stone fruit characters, what the Bordelais might call the noble end of the ripening spectrum of Sauvignon Blanc, and the nectarine white peach characters. And so we want that beautiful fruit to shine through, but to be bright and racy and mouthwatering. One of the beauties of Sauvignon Blanc in Napa Valley is that it gets ripe and it ripens into these more mature fruit flavors, so we don't get any of the grassiness that's there, and that's the charm of, say, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc.
Right.
Here all those Pirozzini characters tend to ripen away, and we're left with citrus and stone fruit, but it keeps beautiful acidity. So this is all natural acidity in here. Not to get too geeky, but it's low pH, racy, mouth-watering acidity.
So well, I was just going to ask, so you're saying that the lacking of the pyrazinic qualities is attributed more to where it's grown than when it's picked?
I would say so. Obviously, it's partly when it's picked, but it's the sunshine and the warm days. So although we get lovely cool nights, of course, in Napa, we do get quite a lot of warmth in the middle of the day. It's looking out of my window, I think yesterday it was happily into the 90s. I think the forecast for today is high 80s. So that's plenty of heat for ripening. And although we had the beautiful marine layer, that ocean cloud or fog that shelters us, that was sheltering the valley until about 10 o'clock or so this morning, the sun's now out, so we get reliable sunshine and heat. And those are important for ripening away the pyrazines, as well. The pyrazines will degenerate if you get plenty of sunshine and warmth onto the berries. However, the cold nights then allow us to preserve the acidity. So what we're getting is, and obviously you do have to wait, or we choose to wait until that has happened, until it's ripened into this flavor window where there are no pyrazines, but we have the beautiful fruit character we want. But by the time it's shifted into that window, we've still got the acidity, and that's the cool thing about Sauvignon Blanc in Napa, I'd say.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's delicious. It's crisp. It's exactly as you're describing it, sir.
Excellent. And then I mentioned earlier the old barrique fermentation, and that's actually the part of the importance of this follows through from that. It's all hand harvested, by the way, because again, machine harvesting can work well for some styles of wine, and the styles that embrace the skin characters, the pyrazines, do well with that. But we don't want any of the phenolics or bitterness from the skin. So this was all hand harvested in the early morning, brought into the winery, whole cluster pressed. And the combination of those two steps means we don't get any phenolics or bitterness or tannin, I suppose, from the skins. And that's critical because we want that crystal clean finish. And also to balance that racy acidity, the barrel fermentation and the lees contact are what sort of balances out that naturally low pH raciness. And so it enables us to make a wine that's bone dry, no residual sugar, ferments until nothing more will ferment. And then the balance to that racy acidity comes from the lees contact, barrel fermentation, the ripeness in the fruit. But to me, it makes a beautiful wine. It evolves across the palate, grabs your attention. You've got a wine in your mouth. It evolves across the palate. One of the things I love about this Fumé Blanc is that it's a really good example of what we aspire to make, wines that are not just a snapshot flavor, as it were, but you taste it and then the flavor evolves through the palate and it just flows and changes. And that's especially true with Sauvignon Blanc. You start getting different flavors coming out after 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. And then, as I say, no phenolics, we hope. So crystal clean finish. And what we hope is, when I do this in tastings, it's fun. I say, think about how your mouth is feeling now.
Yeah.
And it's appetized and it draws you back. And that's what we want to make, are wines that evolve in the palate, keep you intrigued, they draw you in and then leave your mouth watering for another sip, and then brings you back for another sip and then reveals new layers of flavor. And it's that's what we're aiming to do. And I think the Fumé Blanc,
I think you did it. Yeah, that's great. Well, I do want to go to the next wine. I have other questions. Where you were just mentioning looking out the window, where are we for harvest? What do the grapes look like? Are they all gone already?
Yeah, so everything's ticking along nicely. It's been an unusual vintage, but everything's looking good. In some parts of the valley, it started very early, meaning we came out of winter early and we started seeing bud break very early in some varieties. But then it cooled down a bit, and then we got some rain, which was good, fairly late spring. And then it's been sort of warm and cool and warm and cool. It's been going nicely. I think we're now looking pretty much on average. The last I sort of update I heard, I think we'll start to pick Sauvignon Blanc maybe in a couple of weeks from now. 2 weeks from now. So for the reds, we're just about finishing up Veraison. So okay. Cabernet and Oakville is probably mostly through Veraison. It's been going through Veraison, different blocks start at different times and different varieties at different times. Probably started in some of the earlier varieties, like Malbec, I think started 3 weeks ago or so. Cabernet was fully into Veraison for the last 10 days or so. So probably pretty much finished, or maybe the last block's going through Veraison. So obviously a few more months before we pick that. But Sauvignon Blanc, Fumé Blanc, always our first variety, or typically our first variety at Royal Mondavi Winery, probably be coming in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, good to know. Well, let's talk about To Kalon, because we talked about it a little bit, but this is one of the most, again, iconic vineyards, and I think very well known all over the place. And it's what this is entirely from, which is my delicious Corvin Robert Mondavi.
Excellent. Yes. Well, thank you for cracking into a bottle of this. It's when I'm asked to talk about Royal Mondavi Winery, and obviously the Fumé Blanc's a great place to start. And we have our Napa tier wines, but to me, this is the story of Royal Mondavi Winery. Mr. Mondavi's founding vision was to make Napa Valley wines in the company of the great wines of the world. And that is the story. And everything else sort of flows down from that. And so if I'm asked, talking about Royal Mondavi Winery, the Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon is, to me, the story, and the other reserve wines too, but that's where the story is. And I remember when I started with Royal Mondavi Winery 23 years ago, there were a lot of larger wine companies, as it were, who were trying to break into the quality end of things. And one of the things that made the Royal Mondavi story slightly different is we'd started the 1966 vintage of this wine. Basically, it's still phenomenal. It's beautiful. So we started with the vision of making wines in the company of the great wines of the world, and everything else has sort of followed on or flowed on from that. And I think that's an important point to the story, that he deliberately bought land where he knew this had a reputation for consistently growing amazing world-class grapes, because he wanted the story to be, he wanted the winery to be making wines in the company of the great wines of the world. And so this is why, to me, this is the essence of Mr. Mondavi's story. And of course, to me, this is the passion of what we're doing now, is continuing Mr. Mondavi's vision of making a Napa Valley wine that would gladly sit in the company of any of the other great wines of the world.
Did he, was it already named Tokalon? Is that a Robert Mondavi word?
Well, there's a story. Well, there's a long story around this. There was, in the 19th century, and of course, as you know, wine growing in California, commercial wine growing, started after the gold rush. So started in the 1850s, 1860s, and one of the great pioneers of wine and quality wine in Napa Valley was a man called H.W. Crabb, and he planted vines on this site in 1868. Originally called the vineyard Hermosa, but he was not only a very successful winemaker, as it were, and really committed to growing great grapes and pushing the boundaries of research into grape growing. We think he had his nursery, or the number of varieties he had growing on the vineyard, was over 400 varieties, we think. So very experimental and wanting to learn and want to work out what was best. And the winery he had there was very technologically advanced for the day, and mechanized and presses on wheels and that sort of thing, which for the day was very efficient. Yeah. So he was not only pushing the quality there, but he was also, I think, commercially very ahead of the game in some ways. And as often happens, business was a little up and down in California, but in the mid 1880s, he recognized an opportunity to market his wines fairly strongly on the East Coast, or if I would say east of the Rockies anyway. And so he set up agencies in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in Kansas City, in New Orleans, in other major cities on the East Coast. And in the 1880s, those companies, he sort of renamed the company the Tokalon Wine Company. And some places it was called the Tokalon Wine Company, some places it was called the Tokalon Vineyard Company. And so that name started being associated with his wines. But if you see the early usage of the name Tokalon, everywhere it said Tokalon and then registered trademark. And so he had registered it as a trademark for trading his wines and primarily on the east of the Rockies, or the East Coast, major cities further east. And then H.W. Crabb died in 1899. The company basically went to the bank, and then the banker took over running it, and it continued to trade as the Tokalon Wine Company in the early years of the 1900s. And then during Prohibition, it gradually sort of petered out, as a lot of wine companies did. And it was basically, this sounds ironic, I suppose, but there's a beautiful book written in the 1950s called Vines in the Sun, where they referred to Tokalon as being forgotten. So it was literally forgotten about by most people. And then when Mr. Mondavi knew it was a great site, so he bought the site. And of course, if we were to use the phrase, if you know what I mean, if the old timers knew that it was a great site.
What it was.
And of course, it was part of maybe folklore that people knew there'd been a great winery based there, but it wasn't in current usage, and the name had completely fallen out of use. As Mr. Mondavi started to build his story and build his winery, Mr. Mondavi, this would seem crazy to most companies these days, but he actually employed a historian. And part of the job of the winery historian was to tell the history of wine. Because much of Mr. Mondavi's mission, as it were, was to spread the word. Mondavi Winery was still focused on wines in the company of the great wines of the world. But of course, something that has, as it were, been achieved was his idea of wanting to bring wine to the American table. And so telling the history of wine, telling the 5,000-year history of wine, telling the history of California wine. And in that research, the historian, of course, brought up the fact that there had been a famous winery on this site called Tokalon. And so Mr. Mondavi basically revived the the historic name, or the name that that winery had previously been operated under on this site. If you look at maps of the 19th century, of course, the 19th century maps just identified this site as by its owner, H.W. Crabb. And so there's no 19th century map that says Tokelon on the label, but we do know that his company was trademarked as Tokelon. So when we started naming or using that name for the vineyard and telling the story, because it's a pretty cool story that site had been making great wine.
Historic, amazing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So we started telling the story. When people think about vineyards and famous vineyards in the world, often we think, benchmarks are the great French vineyards or the great Italian vineyards. And if you have a vineyard in Burgundy, the government regulates that name. If you say Clos Vougeot on the label, the government is regulating Clos Vougeot. And if you plant a vineyard in the Pays d'Oc and call it Clos Vougeot, the French government says, no, you can't do that. But in the United States, the TTB or the government protects the names of AVAs, American viticulture areas, but it doesn't protect vineyard names. So the only way to protect the name of your vineyard is to trademark it. So in the 1980s, as Rob Mondavi started wanting to use the name Tokelon again and use it for the vineyard, we registered as a trademark, just as H.W. Crabb had done over 100 years earlier. So it's one of those funny things that the only way we can protect that trademark or protect the name of our vineyard, the only thing that stops you and me planting a vineyard in Lodi and calling it Tokelon is that
trademark.
Mondavi Winery has a trademark on that name. So it's yes, it is trademarked. It's the trademark name of vineyard, but I think you'll find any vineyard in California that is using its vineyard name
it's trademarked
designation has a trademark on it. Some of them, in fact, I was looking at a bottle of Fay Vineyard, famous vineyard from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. They actually put the little trademark sign after the vineyard name. So trademark law is what protects other people from using our name. So that's where that I know you introduced that issue. That's where that story comes from. So it's the name of our vineyard, and so we if you know about trademark law, also you have to enforce your trademark in order for it to be protected. So
of course. Well, let's talk about the wine that's from it. We've been talking about it for so long. I want to finally try it.
Absolutely.
You got me ready for it.
So this wine is, again, just as I said with the Fumé Blanc, this wine I hope will be an expression of the Rob Mondavi Winery style and an expression of the vision and the story of Rob Mondavi Winery. So the Tokelon vineyard stretches from Rob Mondavi Winery up to the base of the Mayacamas Hills. It's an alluvial fan. And so the waters wash down in big storms. And of course, as they hit the valley floor, sort of fan out and flow down towards the center of the valley or to the river. And typically at the, big picture generalizations, the bigger pebbles and gravel rich soils tend to get dropped earlier. And so places either at the back of the vineyard or where the flood waters were running faster are more likely to have more gravel-rich, free-draining soil. And then as you come closer down to the road, a bit more sandy and a bit more silty or clay, as it were. Still great soils on the whole thing, but we're more likely to find the origin of our reserve fruit coming from the very back of the vineyard and coming from the more free-draining, gravel-rich soils. What we love about the location for the Tokelon Vineyard on the west side of Oakville is, we're roughly halfway up Napa Valley, if I can be ungeographical like that, but between the south and the north, we're roughly halfway up, which is a great spot for being able to get ripeness, but maintain the freshness if we choose to. So it gets warm during the days, but cools off reliably in the evening. If you've ever had the good fortune to be behind Rob Mondavi Winery and at 5-6 o'clock in the evenings, there's a pretty reliable breeze cooling the vineyard down there. So fruit-wise, if I were to sum up West Oakville or Tokelon, there's a dark black berry fruit character. And then what we're looking for with our style is ripe, but not overripe. So the way I sort of sum it up is it's like the feel of a fully ripe freshly plucked blackberry, as it were. You know, if you pick fresh summer fruit, it's ripe, but it still pops and exciting.
Right.
In the mouth. So we're trying to avoid cooked fruit, jammy fruit characters and keep that brightness and that freshness in the feel of the fruit. Our style as well. So we're in partly doing that. We're harvesting on the early side, I would say. We want it ripe, but other people push for much longer hang time than we do. So in picking on that early side, we sort of embrace more of the non-fruit characters, the positive herbal side, as it were. Geneviève, chief winemaker for many years, refers to garrigue character, that sort of wild shrubberies in the south of France, or the good dried herbs character. So not pyrazine green, but that positive engagement of some of the positive dried herbs. Sometimes a sort of black olive savory character. And so we embrace that with the dark fruit. Another thing about Tocolon is that certainly the way we're growing and harvesting the fruit is it has a fairly strong presence of tannin and acid. And our vision is to make wines that have power but are gentle at the same time. So one of the ways that we, as it were, harness that tannin and acid is we ferment this wine, or ferment the grapes, in large oak fermenting tanks. And what we find is that those, when I say large, they maybe could hold 16 tons. We'll often only put 10, 12 tons in them for fairly small batches, but they will capture more of the mid-palate weight of the wine, and it sort of polishes the edge of the tannins, and it gives a roundness to the tannins. So this wine, I think you'll find, has got a lot of tannin, but it's gentle, what I sometimes call high-quality tannin. And so that the vineyard character coming into the wine, the winemaking is very, literally that cellar was built with the specific, in 2000 vintage, by the way, was when we first used it, was built with the specific intention of working with the fruit from Tocolon Vineyard and interpreting it into the Mondavi winery style. What do you think? And again, just as we said with Fumé Reserve, we want a wine that has presence in the palate. It grabs your attention, and yet it's not a big fruit bomb. It's focused. It's, to me, part of the beauty of great Cabernet Sauvignon is that sort of linear feel that as the wine flows through the palate, and the gently structuring tannins have such a beautiful linear feel. The 16 vintage, I think in particular, has that beautiful structure to it. The acidity that grabs your attention subtly at the start of the palate, sort of lifts the wine all the way through. A few other little things I could mention in the wine. These are not secrets of the way, but one of the, I don't want to say the, what am I thinking? It's not magic secret, but one of the
ingredients.
the wine is almost never 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. And our number one blending component is almost always Cabernet Franc. And what we like, and so there's almost never Merlot in the reserve. Merlot, I find, sort of disrupts, or has the potential to disrupt the flow of the wine, whereas Cabernet Franc complements the middle of the Cabernet Sauvignon, but it adds to that finesse and that flow through the palate. And so as you taste this wine, it just flows seamlessly, harmoniously through the palate, but it also drives through, and the flavors evolve and change as it flows through the palate. And then that acidity.
How much Cabernet Franc are we talking about?
Usually it's typically in vintage to vintage between 5% and 15%. In this vintage, I think it's, in the 16, I think it's 6 or 7%.
Yeah.
And then there's also always usually a dash, as it were, to use one technical term, of Cabernet, of Petit Verdot. There's about 2% Petit Verdot.
Okay.
Again, lovely dark tones and structural element, but grows beautifully on Tocolon, and a small amount can be a great addition to the wine.
Well, you described it perfectly. I mean, it really is. I mean, the acid is nice, the structure is nice, but the tannins is really the thing that you described perfectly, because it's very apparent, but it's not in your face. It's just incorporated and part of it. And then back to the pyrazine thing from earlier, like I don't get, that's why I was asking about the Cabernet Franc, because sometimes that kicks a little bit more of the pyrazinic quality, and I don't get any of it here, and which I quite like to not get very much of it, just my taste, nothing else. But yeah, this is delicious.
The Cabernet Franc ripens really fully and beautifully on To Kalon. It doesn't, some people will say in Napa, Cabernet Franc is a little bit more picky than Cabernet Sauvignon in where it grows. Cabernet Sauvignon can do well in a lot of different sites in Napa, but I've heard a lot of people say that Cabernet Franc needs to be on the right site. Fortunately, To Kalon is one of the sites where it does beautifully well, and so it ripens fully but stays distinctive, and it's almost more of almost a sort of violet floral. And if there is a herbal character, it's a sort of good dried leaves character, not herbaceous. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, and those tannins, of course, goes without saying probably for a high quality Napa Cabernet, but the oak aging is an important part of the process. But I mentioned earlier how Mr. Mondavi was one of the pioneers of using French oak in Napa Valley. He was also, as he was pushing for better and better quality, he was also one of the first winemakers, certainly in the New World, to have the coopers sit down with us and taste our wine in their barrels and other people's barrels. And over the years, in some ways, it was helping hold them accountable for what they shipped over to this strange place around the world that they'd have never sent barrels to. But it was also, in the long term, it's meant we've developed fairly robust partnerships with coopers who now use that as an opportunity to, as any good salesman, what do you need, what do you want, sort of thing. And so we're getting barrels that work really well for our wines or for different blocks of our wines. And one of the things most people, when they smell this wine or taste this wine, you don't notice, you can tell it's been aged in high quality French oak, but you don't notice the oak. It's the wine that shines through mostly. But this spent 18 months in 100% new French oak. And I think it's a tribute to the quality of fruit and a tribute to the quality of the barrels that most people don't call out the oak on this wine. It's beautifully integrated and harmonious. Of course, that also helps polish the tannins and harmonize and integrate the wine.
Well, thank you very much for this. This is delicious. Well, I have kept you for about an hour, so I very much appreciate it. Is there anything that we might have missed? I know. I feel like I could sit here for much longer. Is there anything about Robert Mondavi's story that maybe I forgot to ask about, or I think we?
No, I think we've covered a lot of the important parts of the story. I think the one thing I would say is Robert Mondavi is such a well-known name now that we're constantly having to remind people that we're still doing. We like to think we're still doing what Mr. Mondavi set out to do. And I've had the good fortune over 23 years of working with these wines, of, as it were, the satisfaction of seeing how kindly and positively people respond when you get the wines in the glass. You've kindly enjoyed these wines with me. I think
absolutely
wines, and so just the Robert Mondavi winery story is continuing. We're still making what we believe are wines that reflect Mr. Mondavi's vision. We're making wines that we hope are of a character and a quality that I like to think Mr. Mondavi would be proud of and happy to have represent his vision. Whether it's the Napa Fumé Blanc, which is just such a delightful wine that bursts on the palate. It's, as I say, one of my colleagues used to say, it's almost always available by the glass at my house, because it's a quite multi-purpose wine just to have a glass of while you're deciding what to drink tonight. It's such a versatile, wonderful wine that's still so alive, and still alive with Bob's spirit, I think, all the way up to the Reserve, which obviously it's nearly $180 recommended retail. So we don't have this on the table every day, but it is a wine where, first of all, we're not trying to copy the other wines as well. We're trying to make great Napa Valley wines, and I think this tastes like Napa, it tastes like Oakville, and it tastes like To Kalon. And there's a character year after year that comes through that reflects the specific origin and the vineyard that the fruit came from for this wine. And I think that's an important part of the story. However, it's a wine that also we'd gladly put on the same table as any of the other great wines of the world. And there are many beautiful, beautiful wines made in the world, but I would gladly put this on the same table, and it'll reflect Napa, and it'll reflect what we're trying to do but qualitatively, thank you for helping us spread the word. But we think we're still out there doing what Bob set out to do and make Napa Valley wines in the company of the great wines of the world. So,
I love it. You're succeeding. Thank you so much, Mark.
it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Mike. I hope we'll get to share a glass of wine in person one
In
day.
real life, wouldn't that be great?
All right. You just watched an episode of Right Between the Wines, starring Mark de Vere, who is a master of wine. We also are talking about one of Napa's most amazing wine icons, Robert Mondavi. Now I'm sitting down with Jonathan Lopez, who is the owner of Hampton Street Vineyard, recently reopened. How you doing, Jonathan?
Doing very well.
I'm very happy to have you here. I've had the pleasure of eating in your restaurant once already in the 1 week you've been open, and delicious. Plates look great, service was great, super COVID standards. Loved it. Looking forward to lunch now. Lunch is opened. Is lunch going well? Is it a very different menu than the dinner menu?
I'd say about 30% of the items are different.
Okay.
So maybe 30 to 40%. So a lot more salads and sandwiches, that kind of thing. But a few of the same mains. One of the mains is a different iteration of one of the appetizers, but really, really solid lunch stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. If anybody doesn't know, Hampton Street Vineyard was opened, I want to say 25 years ago by Lee Talmadge, and just a few months ago changed hands, closed for a couple of months, and you guys just reopened a couple weeks ago. So fantastic. And Hampton Street Vineyard, if you've never been there, I think it's a Columbia favorite for years and years. What Lee did there is huge, and people love it, and obviously very well known for their wine list, which is going to go right into the next cans while we have an advanced sommelier, probably one of two in the city, I think, both working at your restaurant, but we'll get there in a second. One other thing I did want to mention is that at the very first episode of season 2 of Ride Between the Wines, which was my going live video episode, Jonathan actually came on me and did a little, I was starting a local wine definitions with people in the restaurant industry locally, but it only went about 3 episodes before COVID hit, and then I couldn't see people, so we've kind of replaced it with restaurants reopening segment we're doing now. But check that out, I'll put somewhere. That being said, take 5 questions, and here we go. Question number 1 is called Somm. Where? Out there. Thank you, spell like Somm. All right. As one of the 2 advanced level sommeliers, obviously anybody who doesn't know, you just watched the episode, we're talking about Master of Wine, so there's a whole lot of certifications, but the 2 highest acclaimed in the world of wine would be Master of Wine and then Master Sommelier, with Advanced, which is what you are, which is huge way up there. From what I understand, from level 2 to level 3 is a huge jump up from the levels of things that are necessary. So what I want to know is, as your process progressed to get to Advanced Somm, what was the toughest thing for you? Like, I know there's a service and knowledge and tasting and...
Service for sure, because you're having to multitask. Mm-hmm. So doing blind tasting for me is always a lot of fun. It's even in a really stressful situation, being with master sommeliers is just something I love to do and really enjoy. So that never feels as stressful because it's you're deducing, it's detective work, and it's
a game.
It's kind of a game. Yeah, it's fun. For the theory portion, you're sitting. It's kind of you don't really have any distractions. It's just filling out. So is it this or is it that? You know. For the service, it's you're having to do, pour wine, make cocktails, decant wine, all these different things while you're being orally examined as well. And so they're asking you, peppering you with questions as you're doing service, which is what regular restaurant service is.
Doing,
so
right?
it's good that they do that. But obviously the level of questions are a little bit more challenging than you would get from a normal guest.
So, and they're asked by master somms, obviously, who are sitting at the tables that you're.
And again, you don't want to flub in front of a master sommelier. You want to make a good impression. You want to sound smart. You want to keep your composure.
I can imagine the head game, like the second you say something wrong and you're walking back to the bar again, you're like, oh, it was giggle, or whatever, something that was on the tip of your tongue, and I'm sure it gets in your head for the rest of the
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you walk around with it for the rest of the day, replaying everything, and oh yeah, nope, I got it wrong. Okay, well, but and I almost failed on that portion. But luckily, I think I just scraped by on that one. Although I did, I think, pretty well on the other two. So, yeah, it was definitely hard.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I will mention, I think I said it already once, but you guys also, the two of your managing partners there are Arnon and Chelsea. And Chelsea is also an advanced Somm who you met while going through the Somm class. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, so at the advanced, everyone has to take the advanced class before they take the test. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I met her, and kind of the New Yorkers found each other pretty quickly. I feel like that's every group of people from a certain area were like, oh, you're from, you know?
And there you are, yeah.
So that's how we met, and, you know, we became fast friends, and now she's here in Colombia with us, yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool, yeah. I imagine your wine list is going to grow and be awesome and cool and fun, and, you know.
Yeah, definitely. So, it's definitely going to change a little bit. I mean, I think Lee did a fantastic job about curating that list, and right now it's about 500 different SKUs or different selections that are there, and we're kind of basically trying to fit it a little bit more into the mold of the French brasserie, or not the French brasserie, so the American brasserie concept. And so largely American and French, but maybe fill out the French section a little bit more. And hoping that the city kind of responds
well to it.
Yeah.
Well, I have hope. I think you will.
Yeah.
All right, question number 2. This is called story time. So you have been obviously in the restaurant industry before you got here for a very long time. Do you have a one of your favorite, funniest, or best restaurant moments that you can tell?
So there's a lot of different interesting things that happen in restaurants, from meeting celebrities to, low points of crying in the bathroom. But I think actually one of my favorite stories is, I think, a story I've told you already. And it actually is not my story necessarily, but it's one that I think is really indicative of working in New York high-end restaurants. And it's a story that was told to me by a gentleman named Michael Nelson, who was one of my mentors in New York. And he was talking about working at a Cafe Boulud, which is on the Upper East Side, a Michelin star restaurant, white tablecloths. It's in a nice hotel, but their clientele has been going there forever, and they're all millionaires, and they have certain sets of expectations that come with that. So a lot of them had set reservations for set days at certain tables, and there was this one day that one of the regulars came in on the day that wasn't their regular day, and they breezed right past the host stand and went right to that table, and they demanded that that table get out of their to leave their table. So it's just like that level of just like brashness and entitlement, I think, kind of just encapsulates some of the more
challenges,
more of the challenging things you experience in a restaurant. But I think it's just so hilarious because it's just like,
wait. So what happens? Does the table get up?
Oh no, definitely not. Because that's their table that night, But before it becomes a thing, the maitre d' comes and swoops them away and go, Mister, let me take care of you.
You got to be prepared to fix right.
Exactly. And so I think that kind of encapsulates everything with restaurants in terms of just, the guest is always right even when they're not right, and you have to find a way to fix it. So I mean, that's kind of what restaurants is about, is making people happy, and accommodating and creating a great experience. And sometimes crazy things are thrown at you, and you have to maneuver. So
yeah, exactly. Encapsulates all that. All right, question number 3. This question is called "May the Force be with you." All right, so when I first met your managing partners a couple weeks ago before you opened up, Chelsea and Arnon, I was wearing a Rey Skywalker mask, so we started talking about Star Wars, of course, yeah. And they mentioned the two of them kind of have their Star Wars character that they sort of embodied are R2 and C-3PO. Right. And then they talked to me, and obviously I said Obi-Wan because, he's amazing. What's your Star Wars character? What's your...
Oh my gosh. So I've watched some Star Wars.
Oh god,
but
interview over.
I know. I thought you knew this about me already. Like, I don't have like the whole thing in Oh man.
This is gotcha journalism at its best.
This is gotcha journalism. What is the dashing one that like kills all the bad guys and
oh my
know,
god,
is,
this is the worst.
this is the worst, isn't it? That guy. I'm that guy.
The dashing one who kills all the bad guys. I don't. I guess we'll give you Luke. If you ask my wife, it would be Kylo Ren. I don't know.
Yes,
you're gonna go with Kylo Ren.
I would love to be Adam Driver, just like in general.
Adam Driver is, like in the first movie. Well, you didn't see the movies; it doesn't matter. At first, I don't know how I feel about him, but now I absolutely love the guy. And you see some of the other movies he does, like he's like comedian and like big range and all over the place, and yeah, very cool guy. All right, I'll give you Adam Driver. That's gonna be your answer.
I'd like to be as buff as Adam Driver too.
I think we would all
Yeah.
like to. I would like to have the hair of Adam Driver. You're probably okay there. All right, question number 4. This is called Ooh La La. So, as somebody who is now opening or is open a French-themed restaurant, I want to know, with your wine background, this might be the hardest question I'm going to ask you. What is your favorite French region for wine?
I think the Star Wars question was definitely the hardest question because of my ignorance. But in terms of my favorite French wine region, I'd probably have to say Champagne. Champagne is something that I think goes with a wide variety of food, several different styles. There's a lot of unique growers and producers in Champagne, and I think it kind of gets pigeonholed into one thing as a celebratory drink, and a lot of the large houses kind of capitalize on that. But there's a lot of unique, interesting producers, a lot of different regions, a lot of different nuances with Champagne, and it compared really well with different kinds of cuisines. And so, I'll drink a bottle of Champagne through dinner any day. Yeah.
I'm 100% with you.
Yeah.
So, flutes or no flutes?
No flutes.
No flutes. Thank you. Marketing questions.
My favorite Champagne glasses are the Le Mans glasses, and I think Tim is the only one that has those in town. So I have to talk to him about where he got those.
That's Tim Gardner from Lula Drake,
yes,
in case you don't
exactly.
know what Tim we're referring to. Fantastic. Great. I was going back and forth in my head when I read that question. I was like, Champagne was definitely at the top of what I thought you were going to go with. For me, I thought you were going to go with Champagne or Burgundy. I would have guessed those were your top 2. But
yeah, I mean, I really love Burgundy. I just can't afford Burgundy. It's kind of interesting. Champagne is it's seen as like a luxury wine, but you go to a restaurant, you could buy a bottle for $100, and it's a really, really solid bottle of wine. And if you buy a $100 bottle of Burgundy, it's kind of, who knows how good it's going to be.
right. It's unlikely to be at that.
Yeah, like 150 is kind of where it starts with Burgundy for really solid wines, and I don't have that kind of cash reserve right now. So.
Yeah. Well, you did just open a restaurant. All right, question number 5 is called Stick the Landing. And Stick the Landing is really what I ask as the last question every time, which is tell me what is special about your restaurant and what separates it from the other restaurants out there.
So I think there's a lot of things that are really unique about the restaurant. So everything or anything from the unique location and the unique building it's in. It's in the Sylvan Building, which is a historic Napoleon III style building in South Carolina. It's like the only one that exists here in the state, so I think that's really unique.
Awesome. Yeah.
We did a lot of work to try and match the interior to the exterior a little bit to make it feel a little bit more brasserie chic, I would say. Also, I mean, we're the only people, like you had mentioned, we have 3 sommeliers on staff. All the owners are sommeliers. Largest wine list in Colombia. I know that for a fact because I worked at the second largest wine list in Colombia, which is also a very good wine list at Halls. So those 2 things are really unique in terms of cuisine. And we're the only brasserie in town. If you don't know what a brasserie is, it's just a French eatery that has classic French dishes. And it historically was more beer focused, but it's kind of changed over time in terms of what the exact definitions are. But basically, I mean, what we're doing is doing classic French dishes, but kind of updating them. So everything from a duck à l'orange, which you never see on a menu anymore, to a tuna niçoise that's done in a crudo style, which is not typical of the dish. Typically it's like fluffy salad.
More like a salad, yeah.
Exactly. So we're having a lot of fun with everything we're doing at the restaurant, and we're trying to keep it, approachable as well. You know, we have a burger that's made with a croissant bun from a Small Sugar.
Great.
And so they made it custom for us, which is really cool. And we're putting a little French flag on the top. You know, it's we want to make sure that, when people come to our restaurant, that even though it is a nicer restaurant, that they know it's not intimidating, that they're going to have fun, and that they're going to have excellent service, drinks, the whole shebang. So.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to go there more. It's Hampton Street Vineyard. They're open Tuesday through Saturday for lunch and for dinner. Make reservations. Also, I should have said this earlier, but we were talking about Robert Mondavi in this episode. You can definitely try some of the wines we were talking about in the restaurant. But other than that, Jonathan, thanks so much.
That's my
Good
pleasure.
luck.
Thanks.
There you have it, riders. Thank you so much for joining today. Definitely check out Robert Mondavi's wine. Thank you so much to Mark de Vere. Absolutely fantastic. I could have talked to you for hours. Check out Hampton Street Vineyard. The food is delicious. They've just recently reopened. They're open Tuesday through Saturday, lunch and dinner if you're in Columbia. Stick around next week when we're going to be going, still in Napa, to Pine Ridge, talking with two of the winemakers there. Very exciting. If you like the podcast, please press the button, subscribe on my face, tell your friends, share all the posts, blah, blah, blah. Other than that, see you next week. Till then, chin chin.
Cheers!